Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Pan, a professor of communication here at Stanford and senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce both our moderator as well as our keynote speaker for this evening, Craig Allen. So in the program, you'll see that Mike McFall is listed as our moderator, but due to a last-minute conflict, he's not able to join us right now. Our moderator, Hongbin Lee, actually needs no introduction given this audience, but I will go ahead anyway. He is the faculty co-director and founder of the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. He's the James Liang Endowed Chair at Stanford and a professor by courtesy of economics. He's also a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Hongbin is also a Stanford alum, so maybe there are other alums in the room, who received his PhD in economics from Stanford in 2001. He's been a professor at a number of elite universities in Asia, including the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Tsinghua University. Hongbin is someone who builds institutions in addition to studying them. He founded the Institute of Economics and Finance of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the China Social and Economic Data Center at Tsinghua. He also founded the Chinese College Student Survey and the China Employer-Employee Survey. So Hongbin will be moderating the Q&A portion of the keynote. And now on to introduction of our keynote speaker, Craig Allen. Craig Allen is the president of the U.S. China Business Council. He has had a long and distinguished career in U.S. public service, much of which has been spent in the Asia region and on China-related issues. Craig began his government career at the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration after serving various posts and positions at U.S. embassies, including those in China and Japan. Craig became the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia at the International Trade Administration, and he later was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for China. So immediately prior to becoming president of the U.S. China Business Council, Craig served as the United States ambassador to Brunei from 2014 to 2018. And just a slight bit on the organization, though Craig today all of his remarks will be in his personal capacity and not in his official capacity as president of the U.S. China Business Council. But just for some context, the U.S. China Business Council is a private, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of actually nearly 300 American companies that do business in China. And the organization's mission is to expand the U.S.-China commercial relationship. So as I mentioned, all the remarks today are in his personal capacity, and very excited to hear Greg's remarks, especially in this uncertain time in U.S.-China relations. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. What an honor it is to give this inaugural address. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm grateful to speak with you today for a few minutes on a personal basis. These views are my own, and they don't reflect the positions of the U.S. China Business Council. So a short while ago, I had an opportunity to chat with the governor of one of China's poorest agricultural provinces. And I asked him, what are your top economic priorities? And he replied, without thinking, semiconductors, software, biotechnology, robotics, aerospace, batteries, and new energy vehicles, neatly reciting all of the key industries under the Made in China 2025 plan. Now, I would have thought that addressing the immediate needs of his overwhelmingly rural constituents might be at the top of his priorities list, but I was wrong. The governor, and probably every other successful central, provincial, and local government official, is incentivized to contribute to the top priorities of the central government. And like all of them, he was going to do his best to advance these central government goals. Their individual and collective top priority is technology. This incident reinforced to me the very strong impression that the Chinese government, from top to bottom, is engaged in a techno-utopian quest that is breathtaking in scope. China's unswerving and unquestioning commitment to advanced technology to resolve virtually every problem is going to have profound consequences for China and for the rest of the world. And in China, there is very little discussion about the downsides, about the costs or the trade-offs of technology. So let me please discuss this techno-utopian vision that I see being advanced. And let's start with the background. Why techno-utopianism is such a natural fit for the Chinese government and the Communist Party. First, it's helpful to recall China's commitment to science and technology is not a new phenomenon. Students of Chinese history will recall that over 100 years ago, the student protesters of the May 4th movement called for a new culture based on science and democracy. Second, China's current techno-utopianism is perfectly congruent with Marxism. Marx would be strongly supportive of the materialistic and dialectic progress of ever-advancing technology toward an unspecified utopian goal. Third, Lenin would be even more enthusiastic about the Communist Party using technologies, especially information technologies, to advance economic planning and to extend control of the party over society. Fourth, Confucianism is not even slightly hostile to technology. Indeed, you see the same techno-utopian tendencies in other Confucian societies, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Fifth, from a leadership perspective, President Xi studied chemical engineering at Tsinghua from 1975 to 1979, and his career shows a very consistent preference for technology and science. And almost all of the other officials around him also have similar technical backgrounds. And finally, the policies and planning of the Chinese government with regard to technology are framed very much in accordance to the CCP's revolutionary tradition. They claim that they wish to be at the vanguard of technology in order to correct the injustices of imperialism and colonialism. So this techno-utopian vision is deeply, deeply rooted in China's historic and ideological structures, and it fits perfectly as a guiding principle for the CCP in the current era. Now, American views of China historically and today have oscillated between overestimation and underestimation of Chinese capabilities. And indeed, I think that the record shows that we seldom get it right. Currently, some of our more jingoistic American compatriots severely underestimate China, believing that China is not innovative at all. And I believe that this view is terribly ill-founded. China has already moved from being an innovation sponge to being an innovation leader. And in this process, they have redefined innovation in a manner that fits China's needs. But China's definition of innovation is different from Silicon Valley's. Here, I'd like to use the McKinsey Global Institute, which helps us to understand 4 drivers of Chinese innovation. First, China benefits from the sheer size of its consumer market, which helps Chinese companies to commercialize new ideas quickly and at incredible scale. Chinese consumers are extremely exacting. Many consumer-oriented companies that thrive in China will do very well elsewhere, and we should not be surprised at the success of TikTok or Temu. They have gone through very rigorous training in China, and then there are hundreds more companies like them. Second, China has an ecosystem that is optimized for efficiency-driven innovation in manufacturing at scale. These manufacturers use lots of agile manufacturing, modular design, and flexible automation. Shein and Xiaomi are beautiful examples. Shenzhen is the capital of the world in fast prototyping and then moving to scale at manufacturing very rapidly. Third, do not underestimate China's capabilities at engineering-based innovation. They have millions of engineers and STEM workers. Huawei may be reviled in some parts of the United States. However, Huawei has demonstrated some of the world's top engineering capabilities. Other Shenzhen companies that come to mind are Tencent, DJI, and BYD. And there are many, many others in the Pearl River Delta area. Fourth, do not underestimate China's rapidly expanding capabilities at science-based innovation. In the most recent budget, R&D spending has been increased at 10%, more than any other budget category. And China has already passed the EU in R&D spending, and they may catch up to the United States soon if we do not up our game. Now, this innovative ecosystem is different from Silicon Valley's. In some ways, it's synergistic, but that will not necessarily be the case in the future. So what exactly is the Chinese government doing from a policy perspective to create a technology lead over the US and the rest of the world? In China, this is broadly being discussed in terms that the Chinese call, quote, the new productive forces, end quote. And at the recent National People's Congress, Xi Jinping gave a speech on this. So let me start out with a quote from Xi. He said, quote, "It is essential to promote the integration between scientific and technological innovation and industrial innovation in a coordinated way to develop strategic emerging industries and to arrange the development of industries for the future, as well as to accelerate the development of a modern industrial system." So that is his objective, if you will, for the new productive forces. But I think that we need to get more granular. So there are 5 things that I would have to say about the new productive forces that distinguish Shenzhen from Silicon Valley. First, the new productive forces very clearly recognize that China faces a labor shortage, an acute labor shortage that is only going to get worse. Thus, the government-guided efforts focus on factory automation and efficient production in mature industries. They want to move rapidly up the value chain by using robotics, precision manufacturing, and mass customization, and they are moving very quickly in this mode. Second, they want to spur innovation and create new industries at almost any cost. In a manner that is not constrained by the market, they are willing to throw vast sums of money and capital and unlimited numbers of engineers into developing the products of the future. Third, there's an overwhelming preference for self-reliance and import substitution. The role that foreign companies can play has been described in the official media as follows. Quote, "China should continue to import cutting-edge technologies from outside without over-reliance to provide experiences for the purposes of breakthroughs in China's original technology." So we are welcome to invest, but the purpose would be what the Chinese call 再创新, or re-innovation, oftentimes from foreign models. Fourth, there's plenty of government support. On the financing side, there's a huge sum of public money to support the new productive forces. And Barry Naughton of UCSD has done a splendid job here, if my memory serves, estimating at 10 to 11% of GDP available over the next 5 years for industrial support. Scott Kennedy comes out with at CSIS, comes out with very similar numbers that China has about 1.8% of GDP available annually for industrial support. And these numbers are both 4 times higher than the next highest subsidizer which would be South Korea. The fifth thing that we should all watch very carefully is China's plans to turn data into, quote, the fifth factor of production, end quote, behind land, capital, labor, and entrepreneurship. Now, the NDRC has developed a data division, which is hard at work, hand in hand with the cyber administration of China. It'll be fascinating to watch what the NDRC does with data. One way of looking at this is perhaps a spear and a shield, the NDRC being the spear and the cyber administration being the shield. In short, the new productive forces represent a doubling down of the Made in China 2025 type policies implemented with yet more information, attention, vigor, and resources. Now, in my discussions with Chinese government officials, they believe up and down the chain that these policies are 100% correct, and they are absolutely committed to their systematic implementation, regardless of the costs. In my estimation, implementation of the techno-utopian vision does not much help the average Chinese person, especially those living in rural China, far away from the glitzy cities or the dazzling companies. Stanford's own Scott Rozelle has done a superb job at highlighting the profound challenges that non-elite Chinese face. It is doubtful that the new productive forces will reach them, and arguably the new productive forces will lead to yet more inequality and further widen the rural income gap. Another group that might prefer other policies are Chinese private companies writ large. This group is in a deep funk. Their access to credit from the government banks is highly circumscribed. Internal markets are poor. They are worried about deflation. There hasn't been an IPO in Shanghai in 3 years. There's overcapacity everywhere, and they realize that they can't compete against the SOEs. So now that I've laid out what I believe are the contours of the new productive forces, I'd like to kind of take a look at this from a WTO and an IMF, or a trade policy and then an economic policy perspective, and then a couple comments on U.S. economic national security concerns, and finally a few comments on corporate concerns. So from a WTO perspective, I've emphasized subsidies, and these are important because, if for no other reasons, that they're actionable under the WTO. But it's important to note, in addition to subsidies, the Chinese government uses a whole armory of WTO compatible and WTO non-compatible measures. Indeed, USCBC maintains a database of some 130 Chinese industrial policy measures that the Chinese government uses to promote its own industry, often at the expense of China's trading partners. These 130 industrial policies fall into a number of buckets, including government procurement, state-owned enterprise procurement, industrial standards, IP policy, tax policy, customs, and a number of others. Under the WTO, WTO members are all obligated to keep trade-related documents in the public sphere. Secret documents are not permitted within the WTO. However, in the case of China, we know of at least 2 classified Chinese government or party documents that have a significant impact on technology trade. Specifically, document 551 was proclaimed last year by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Information, Industry and Information Technology. This document lays out a time frame for the elimination of imports of many medical devices in some 300 different categories. We have copies of document 551, and I've asked for it to be repealed many times with no action taken thus far. Also, a document 79 is purportedly published by the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, or Guozhouwei, which owns the state-owned enterprises. Now, this secret document, which I do not have, purports to remove all foreign technology from the tech stack of Chinese SOEs over a relatively short period of time. Although I don't have a copy of the document, we see reflections of document 79 and its implementation in many SOE bid and tender documents. The WTO was written before the advent of the internet or genomics. Thus, the WTO does not provide a really good rule book on how to manage trade in the technological area. But suffice it to say that China is not living up to its WTO obligations in the technology space. And I would dare say that the US government isn't doing a great job at this either. The current WTO system of rules simply cannot survive the intense rivalry between the United States and China in trade, technology, and finance. So let's look at this from the IMF perspective. Although the WTO may be fading out of relevance, the IMF macroeconomic perspective is extremely useful, in my opinion. Some economists have said that China is responsible for 18% of the world's population and about 17% of world GDP. But China is responsible for only 12% of global household consumption. And the inevitable consequence of underconsumption is overinvestment. China is responsible for an estimated 30% of total fixed capital investment, and it is that overinvestment that has led China to control 31% of total global manufacturing, a number which they seek to increase. Through financial repression, Chinese government policy offers only limited savings alternatives to the Chinese people. Chinese government policy perpetuates excessive savings and investment at the expense of household consumption. And this fixation on expanding the supply side and limiting growth of the demand side has reached its natural limits. Further supply side stimulus produces diminishing returns. The world is simply too small to accept additional Chinese overcapacity in the manufacturing sector. The IMF clearly recognizes this distortion and suggests that corrections are urgently needed. The IMF suggests that China must expand pensions, remove hukou restrictions, increase the role of the private sector, increase healthcare insurance and unemployment insurance, restrain SOEs, and improve the lives of ordinary Chinese. This is surely correct. But those demand-generating policy initiatives are not the highest priority of the Chinese government. They do want a little bit more demand, but they want a lot more supply-side stimulus, the opposite of the emphasis that the IMF would prefer. The international spillovers from Chinese policy to expand innovation and manufacturing at all costs also creates economic distortions around the world, including in the United States. Technology is a big part of this problem. So, Treasury Secretary Yellen, during her recent visit to China, was correct to highlight the international costs of overcapacity in the industries that China chooses to subsidize and support. We know that a combination of subsidies and other types of industry-specific incentives created overcapacity in steel, aluminum, solar panels, and wind turbines. And this led to price destruction on a global basis. Only on a global basis, those companies that receive the unwavering support of the Chinese government can survive this Darwinian price destruction struggle. With industrial policies at the scale of China's, the trade policies of any WTO member are simply overwhelmed and become irrelevant. You could kind of summarize this by saying that industrial policy has eaten trade policy for lunch. So governments around the world are reacting to China's industrial policy with measures that are ironically a lot like Chinese policies. In the case of the United States, the IRA, the infrastructure bill, and the CHIPS Act were largely passed to counter the Chinese challenge. So earlier in the morning, I noted a number of novel American policies that the U.S. government is experimenting with to try to address the concerns of very rapid expansion of Chinese tech companies. But I would note that these measures are new, they are novel, they have not been tested, and largely they are outside of the WTO. And so it is interesting to watch this process. There might be a small yard and high fence, but the yard appears to be expanding and the fence seems to be getting taller. And all of this is in reaction to Chinese industrial and technological policies. It is important to note that China's fixation on technology has direct implications for the national security of the United States and our allies. This is brought into stark relief by China's unwavering support for Russia, especially in the context of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and China's ongoing threat to all NATO members. China's partnership with Iran and North Korea are also concerns, as these countries are sometimes operating independently and sometimes in consultation or in partnership with China and Russia. These concerns associated with technology transfer and joint technology development are further more acute given China's foreign intelligence law of 2017 and the top leadership's commitment to civil-military fusion. Given China's geopolitical ambitions as a rising power and America's commitment to the status quo and defending the international rules-based order, it's hard to see how our geopolitical constraints might be better managed. While conflict is certainly not inevitable, tensions will need to be managed carefully as we try to nudge our way to a more sustainable rules-based multipolar order. But that is certainly not guaranteed. From a corporate perspective, the decline of U.S. China relations generates huge uncertainties and complexity. To date, Silicon Valley and Shenzhen have had a pretty complementary relationship. Silicon Valley was able to outsource a lot of the labor-intensive operations to China and have benefited from Chinese excellence in manufacturing. However, we need to ask, is this model sustainable? If it is sustainable, what changes need to be made? And I think that we all just have to recognize we live in a political world. Companies have to recognize that a potential future conflict between the United States and China would make it impossible for most international trade and investment to continue. And this is not limited to a direct conflict between China and the United States. If there was a conflict between China and any treaty ally of the United States, such as the Philippines, there would be an abrupt cessation of normal trade and commerce. And it is for this reason that many American companies are scenario planning to ensure that they would be able to continue in the event of Russia-like sanctions being placed on American companies doing business in China. But this is an intensely difficult problem for many of the companies in the Silicon Valley area. But short of conflict, there remain many other concerns that need to be managed. So let me say just a couple of words before I close about some of the most salient issues for American companies invested in China. A couple of words on export controls, the tech stack, data flows, R&D, and the most difficult subject of all, talent. So on export controls, we could just summarize and say there's been an enormous impact of export controls on American companies and potentially American competitiveness over the longer term. The New York Fed summarized this in a report just published 2 weeks ago, and they said that by forbidding U.S. firms to export to a selected list of Chinese firms for national security reasons, export controls generate a selective decoupling of U.S. firms from China. The broad-based decoupling by export controls is not offset by the creation of new customers in other countries. And indeed, as the total number of customers of American tech companies declines, this creates collateral damage on the same firms which it is meant to protect. The New York Fed estimates in the small subset of companies, tech companies, that they looked at, that $130 billion of market cap was lost. And that when new export controls are announced, employment declines by 7%. And that is significant. Let me summarize. It is especially detrimental for American companies when export controls are unilateral, enforced by the American government only on American companies. In such cases, and there are many, unilateral export controls asymmetrically hurt American firms and long-term American competitiveness. On the tech stack, as I hope I have demonstrated, the Chinese government is trying to force Chinese companies to eliminate foreign products, starting with foreign government purchases and then moving on to SOEs. The most recent iteration of this is that several American chip companies have been banned from selling to an ill-defined range of Chinese customers, mostly SOEs. And while this is described as a national security measure, it will certainly also help to promote their Chinese competitors by creating an artificial market where one did not exist before. Unfortunately, we're seeing that American tech companies in China are coming under increasing pressure from both governments. Given the push and pull between the two governments, it's hard to see, for me to see, how this would stop. The Chinese government procurement actions are going to put SOEs, that is their own companies, in a very difficult place. But the unfortunate question is, we don't know who's going to be hurt more, American companies or Chinese companies. Both are going to suffer damages. Let me say a couple words about data flows. Another very sensitive issues. China's Cyber Administration, or CAC, has announced a bevy of controls that American companies are finding very difficult to implement. The main problem is that the CAC wants to be able to control cross-border data flows that may involve quote-unquote important information, but they decline to define the word important. The uncertainty over China's outbound data regulatory regime is causing anxiety for all multinational companies. We don't know how to invest in our IT structures. We don't know how to maintain connectivity between our China operations and our global operations. Frankly, we don't know when we'll cross over an invisible line and be subject to Chinese penalties. The US government appears to wish to join the Chinese government in regulating outbound data flows, according to a recent executive order from the White House. This creates additional uncertainty for American companies who may have to seek Department of Justice advice on what had been routine data exchange. On R&D, I'd note a German executive, not currently in the room, from a German chemical company who, not in the room, who at the CDF recently suggested, or China Development Forum, recently suggested that Germany and China set up an R&D Silk Road to enhance the mutual benefit for both German and Chinese companies. So highly does he value doing R&D in China. And it is not only the Germans who benefit from joint R&D with China. Many American companies also do R&D in China to the benefit of their overall corporation. Most of the American corporate R&D in China is done to help to localize the international product. But more and more, we're seeing R&D coming out of American-owned facilities in China that is impactful for the American company's global operations, and that will be even more true in the future. The big kahuna, the most difficult problem that we face is talent. I would cite the case of a U.S. multinational company who found that one of their lead scientists in China was denied a visa to the United States, where he couldn't visit his own laboratories that he was running. Now, we were able to get that visa situation worked out. However, this Chinese researcher is not atypical. We have Chinese scientists and engineers are very important for global U.S. competitiveness. And this story is emblematic of the difficulty of moving talent around the world and of American companies being able to access that talent in China, in the United States, and in this particular case, in a network of laboratories around the world. In short, American companies need to access Chinese talent if they are to remain globally competitive. If American companies are barred from hiring Chinese talent, then other companies will be given a long-term structural advantage that probably over a very short period of time will impact American competitiveness. So in conclusion, let me say that the Shenzhen model and the Silicon Valley model of innovation are both the envies of the world. And it's probably true that Shenzhen and Silicon Valley, and indeed the US and China, have probably much more in common than we realize. But the differences between the two models are also important. It is my view, strongly held, that the Silicon Valley model, which we might call libertarian, will win due to its enthusiastic embrace of diversity and its inherently global nature. However, let's give the Shenzhen model the respect that it deserves as a very strong and ambitious competitor. They can mobilize vast resources. They have vast market scale. They have superb engineering talent. They are fast and they are agile. They have a strong government support, and their ecosystem and their infrastructure is second to none. In an ideal world, companies associated with the Silicon Valley model and companies associated with the Shenzhen model would be able to integrate, competing and cooperating on a level playing field with well-known, well-enforced rules. But this is not an ideal world. And unfortunately, that technology-related level playing field and well-enforced rules, they do not exist. there is no level playing field. There are no rules in this competition. And the tensions and the uncertainties that underlie this relationship between Shenzhen and Silicon Valley is the greatest show on earth, and it will play out for the rest of our lifetimes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Craig, for such a fascinating speech. I also find it very entertaining, actually. There's a lot of things. For example, you just said Chinese firms are banning, Chinese government banning Chinese firms to buy chips from America.
Right.
But U.S. government doing the same thing, right?
Right.
So both governments are banning chips to be sold in China. So they seem to be agreeing with each other, right?
Well, I would agree that a lot of the policies, for example, outbound capital flows, control of outbound data flows, control of inbound investment, control over service contracts for pharmaceutical companies. These are quite reminiscent of Chinese policies. And I think that that is because the U.S. government has just determined that the WTO sanctions that they have on tap are insufficient and ineffective and in the face of incredible Chinese industrial policy. I personally have doubts whether both Chinese industrial policy or American industrial policy will be very effective. I suspect that there'll be a lot of waste in both cases. But that that might be exacerbated by the fact that we're both looking to subsidize the same industries. And for example, in semiconductors or in shipbuilding, you're finding the same policies not only in Japan, not only in China and the United States, but in Japan and in Europe. And how are we going to avoid even larger overcapacity issue in the future? Industrial policies have not historically worked out very well in any country, and I see no reason to suspect that if we do that on a competitive global basis, that they'll work out any better at all. And indeed, I would argue that they will exacerbate the internal tensions in both countries. In our country, our industrial policies are very aggressive right now. You may agree with that or you may disagree with that. But the one number I think that we could all agree on is that we have a 7% budget deficit in the United States in a time of peace and relative economic strength. We're going to be paying for this a long time. That will cause distortions within our own economy in a way to try to catch up with the Chinese in this competition that we have accepted and taken on so enthusiastically. Doubling down when both countries, and add in Europe and Japan, are all pursuing the same industrial policies, I suspect waste will be at a global scale.
Yeah, so it seems that most economists in this room would agree industry policies, especially subsidies
Right.
won't produce champions in industry.
Right.
And may protect the weaker firms from being bankrupt, right? So if industry policies really hurt China's economy, hurt China's innovation, why do the U.S. government advise Chinese government to reduce subsidies?
Yeah.
You're helping China to be more innovative, right?
So there is a narrative in Washington that if your adversary is failing, you want them to keep doing it. But I think that that simply ignores the political dynamics in Europe, America, and Japan. That we need to react to protect employment. And EVs would be the finest example. Now, the Europeans are going to try to limit Chinese imports of electric vehicles through anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And they might come up with, all of which are WTO compatible. And they might be able to come up with, combine the two, 70% duty on Chinese imports. But a BYD sale, as S-A-I-L, costs $10,000 US in China. So that would get you up to $17,000 total shipped cost. And that probably will be insufficient. The United States approach to this same problem has been to reach to Article 25 of the WTO and suggest that this is a national security concern. And to have Chinese connected vehicles on American roads represents an unacceptable national security risk. And so these are two different approaches, and I don't know that either one will work. But I think well, the one thing I would be quite certain of is that the unintended consequences will be enormous. And we will, in future Sky conferences, we'll be debating this for many years to come.
So I will ask one more question. So you seem to suggest both views about China. So one view is that Chinese firms are really successful. They are dominating the world, right?
Yeah.
Another view is that China's failing.
Yeah.
The economy is failing. The government is failing. So they want to subsidize the firms, but where is the money from?
Yeah.
So if they are failing, why do we worry about it?
So the secret to most of the successful Chinese technology companies, there are different types. But one of the keys of success, particularly in the manufacturing sector, has been local government subsidies and local government support and local government and local SOE procurement, providing a haven for them to grow. And there are 75 EV manufacturers in China. Each of them has a government supporter behind them. I would note, however, that there's a whole body of new Chinese companies, and I would certainly put DJI in there, Tencent, Ali, and many others, who really want nothing to do with the government or Made in China 2025, and indeed who really are hurt by such government policies, which the United States and many other governments project onto companies that are truly independent, run by truly globally magnificent entrepreneurs. And China has many of them who really are successful despite the government policy. And we saw something very similar in Japan. The companies that the Japanese government supported in the 1990s, they're not doing very well. But the Japanese companies like Kyocera or Sony or Honda, which were not supported by the Chinese companies, they went on to be the world beaters. And I suspect that we'll see something very similar in 5 or 10 years, that those Chinese companies that received Chinese government support are not ultimately going to be successful. They're going to be successful at harvesting subsidies. They're not going to be successful on the global market. Those Chinese entrepreneurial companies that don't want, have not used government support, and the gladiators within that very a competitive Chinese market. Those are the ones that will be globally dominant. And I hope that there's room for them in the global economy. I think that Chinese entrepreneurial drive and creativity is something to be celebrated and welcomed, notwithstanding or taking into account the national security concerns that also exist with such private companies.
Okay, let's open up for questions from the floor. Scott, you're first.
Thank you, Craig. I've heard you several times, and is more and more new stuff. It's fantastic. You talked about Silicon Valley companies, the impact they have. That was very interesting, especially for this group. I'd like to know what you think, how all this is affecting U.S. businesses inside China, right? The Dell, Johnson & Johnson, Boeing, Bank of America, right? GM. What are they doing? And how does it compare to, I think, what Jörg told us on the German companies where they're attracting the top experts and then having trouble with the small SMEs? Well, what do you think?
You know, I think that in general, when you're in any foreign market, you want to be working along the lines that the government wants you to work. But in the case of China, the companies who are not in the tech area are actually mostly doing just fine, thank you. If you're in fashion or energy or ag or consumer goods, consumer entertainment, financial services, travel, etc., life is pretty good. The market's not great, but life is pretty good. When you get to the tech angle, where the Chinese government perceives that it has national security concerns, and the U.S. government perceives that it has national security concerns, and those are the same industries, it gets much more complicated. But I would say life sciences, pharma, medical devices, doing very well right now so far. Aerospace, complex, not doing great. But then you get into tech, and I've been out here for the last few days visiting my members and kind of trying to support them, obviously. I think that there are many grounds for concern in the semiconductor industry in particular. At what point do they hit a conflict of law? And we're trying to avoid that conflict of law where any move you make, you're going to break one law or the other. And it's becoming more and more difficult to avoid that conflict of law. And either government at any time could force you into that conflict of law, thereby terminating or severely restricting what had been a very profitable enterprise, perhaps for decades, right? So there's a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety. And I think that that's true across the board in tech, much less true in other areas. But at the same time, China's extremely important for the tech companies. Many of them have a large percentage share of their total sales in China, and many of them draw on that enormous Chinese talent pool in China and outside of China, and that is not something that that they can easily walk away from. The Taiwan situation makes this yet more complicated. And are they able to move product between Taiwan and the mainland and Taiwan? Can they move people between Taiwan and the mainland? That is becoming more problematic. Taiwanese employees might not wish to any longer reside in mainland. That's a phenomenon that we've seen. And so it's becoming more difficult for CEOs and boards really to monitor and closely supervise their subsidiaries or their companies in China. This is more and more challenging every day, particularly as those data flows become more and more constricted, kind of like a more and more narrow channel or wire of data going between the two sides, particularly between R&D teams in China and in the United States. So this is becoming increasingly difficult. I suspect that Jörg can speak to this, but I suspect that the problems that the German companies are facing is almost exactly the same, maybe a little bit less technicolor.
So I do have a question, but feel free not to answer. I saw a big picture, you're shaking hands with President Xi Jinping recently. I know you met him twice in the last 6 months. My questions are, what did you learn from meeting with him? And what was your advice to him?
So my impression was that he's a careful listener, that he understands the problems that face China very well briefed. He spoke without notes and addressed all of the concerns that he had listened to, and that he's very confident that China's economic policies are absolutely correct. And he has great confidence in technology, and that the course that he has set will be implemented effectively and systematically, and that it will lead to the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation by 2049. And I think that there's a degree of confidence there that is very strong. It will be interesting to see at the third plenum in July whether or not there are any significant changes in Chinese economic policy. And I have no idea. But I think that the advice that the party should consider is the advice offered by the IMF most articulately, that there needs to be a rebalancing of supply and demand, and that they've done a great job on the supply side, but there's a huge distortion on the demand side, and that they can address that through pensions, through unemployment insurance, through healthcare insurance, through building of hospitals, by eliminating hukou, allowing the service companies to expand, by promoting the private sector, by limiting the ability of the public sector to grow ever larger without improving total factor productivity, which is what I think we see. And so those recommendations, I think, are very sound, and that if China wants to get out of that middle income trap, that is the only way to do it. I'm a student of Barry Naughton. I agree with, and Scott Rizal, I think that your thoughts are perfectly complementary, and I'm in total agreement.
Thank you, Craig. So in Silicon Valley, we rarely discussed this issue up until recently, but now Yellen has gone to China and talked about stress testing banks in both the US and China. My question to you is, what do you think is the health of US and Chinese banks?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. There was a huge concern sparked by an article in the Wall Street Journal on Monday of last week that the Treasury Department might sanction a Chinese bank for financing weapons or other war materials to Russia. And that caused a huge concern in the global financial community because under Chinese law, the Chinese authorities would have the right to sanction the banks that sanction the Chinese banks. And that would have to be every American financial institution, or theoretically. And putting sanctions on American banks would be crossing a Rubicon River that could lead for a tit for tat that would be much larger than the tech warfare. Thus far, Treasury has not acted, but was it a White House leak? Was it a State Department leak to the Wall Street Journal? I don't know, but Treasury has not acted on that. And I'm very wary of moving this out to sanctioning financial institutions because that could deteriorate, go into a vicious cycle very quickly that would hurt everyone and help no one. So watch this space. I think that the Chinese banking system is under enormous stress, but it's like a slow motion train crash. There's not going to be an event at all. There's not going to be a Lehman event. That's not going to happen. But what is happening, like a slow motion train crash, it's one car goes and then the next car goes and then the next car. What is happening is that they will sacrifice long-term growth for the benefit of not having a crisis. There will not be a crisis. The cost is lower long-term growth. And that is something that is easier to manage and will presumably lead to less social instability. The key question to ask is, how low will housing prices go? So right now they're down maybe 5, 7, 8, 9%. They could go down a lot more, or maybe not. I think that that's the key question to ask. And I think that stress testing of respective financial institutions is a really smart thing to do because I see no reason why Chinese housing prices are going to rise. And let's recall that the 80% of Chinese household income is in their real estate. And so when real estate prices fall, the wealth effect there is enormous. And Chinese households are simply not going to open their wallets and buy anything if they feel that their home prices are going to go down. Look at Japan. I think it's a useful analog. Japanese home prices over the last 30 years have fallen 70, 80%. Not everywhere, but on average. I don't think that you'll see that in China, but in the third, fourth tier cities, why would you not see significant housing price declines? Beijing, Shanghai, that's not going to happen. But out in the provinces, what's to stop it?
So maybe the last question. So maybe Zhigo,
you mentioned Shenzhen. Okay. Also, Shenzhen is one of the local government, and we had a understanding of how China grow, and Shenzhen's this Silicon Valley, like a VC type of thing. I want to ask you. So that's part of the story. And the other side is that we kind of feel like now China has changed in the past 5 years, especially the local government. They're the objective might change. Do you feel that Shenzhen, this VC thing that in your theme topic, the Shenzhen government leading and the way they functioning has different?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you. So 2 weeks ago was the IMF World Bank meetings in Washington, and so I had the privilege to sit down with the Chinese delegation and talk about issues like this. And they wanted to push back on the overcapacity issue. And so I pushed back on them and saying, no, this is all about local government subsidies. And they pushed back on me saying, well, that's a thing of the past. Local governments don't have that income anymore because they can't sell real estate. And so therefore, you don't have to worry about that thing. It's not a thing anymore. And I found that really fascinating. And I do think it's true that local government, the central government, and I would say the Ministry of Finance, but also the central bank and the financial regulators, they are going to have a lot more visibility into local government finances now than they had in the past, because the perpetual machine of selling land and having local government resources to invest in infrastructure or whatever they wanted to invest in is broken. There's no more land sales. But does that mean that local government subsidies will stop? And my response to that would be to be very skeptical. I don't think that the central government knows. And I don't know that they want to know until there's a crisis. So it'll be very interesting to watch. Shenzhen has plenty of money, no problem there. But almost every other government in China, local government in China, is...
other city, Hefei, you might have heard about it.
Yeah.
Very successful.
There are a number, but they are the exception to the rule. The rule is that Chinese local governments are under severe financial stress, and they are unable to continue to subsidize technology. And what is that going to mean? Will the central government flow funds down to them for the purpose of subsidizing technology? I don't know. And how will they preference that over paying their own workers? I don't know. I think that this will be a very interesting area for empirical research over the next year or two. But the one thing that I do know is that the overall banking system, right, is geared towards the techno-utopian vision, right? They're not going to allow IPOs unless they're in that sphere. The SOE banks are going to be channeling money there. The pension funds and institutional investors are going to be supporting that techno-utopian vision. That's for sure. Whether or not local governments can subsidize that, I think is up for a question. But the overall structure, I firmly believe, will continue along the lines that I have suggested.
Yeah, thank you. I know we are 10 minutes over, so I'm sure we are going to invite Craig back again.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's give Craig another round of applause.